We are back with our Charlotte Mason Book Club on Volume 6, and we have made it all the way to Chapter 5. Woo!
Yay!
How long is this taking? I don't know. We're not going to fall on that.
It doesn't matter. We're not on a time frame here.
Yes,
we're learning for knowledge's sake, right?
That's exactly right. Yes, we are slowly just digesting these seeds and pondering them. So we're not in a rush, right? Yes. So we are in Chapter 5.
Right.
Chapter 5 is called The Sacredness of Personality. And I thought it was a really interesting title because I was expecting it to discuss more of the different personality types, because I feel like that is something, A, that I'm super interested in, but B, a very kind of modern topic of discussion, right? And figuring out people's personality traits, whether it's like what kind of spirit animal you are, or like what your Myers-Briggs is, or what, like there's all these different tests you could take, right? What's that one? Like caloric.
Melancholy.
I don't even know what the name of that one is, right?
Yeah.
Or just kind of like understanding people, like, ooh, what makes somebody tick? Why does somebody do that versus like someone who does this all the time? And that's not at all what she's talking about in this chapter.
Right. It does. This is probably one of the hardest hitting chapters that we have read, I think, that we've done.
Yeah.
There's so much involved and a lot of digging in this chapter to understand exactly what she's talking about and what the practical implications are for me.
Right. I would have titled it that. I don't even know what I would have titled it, but it seems to me the focus is not so much on like the personality of a child and like understanding them and dissecting them, but more on how the actions that we take influence someone's personality.
Exactly. And how, right, I do totally. And how we use our knowledge to influence or affect our children. Because like she even says in the very beginning, these principles, which she's talking about before she talks about authority and docility, are limited by the respect due to the personality of children, which may not be encroached upon. So that little phrase right there, encroached upon, is what I kept going back to. Okay, all these things that she talks about, which really are not in modern language, which makes this a very kind of a more a chapter that I had to pull out the dictionary and dig through a little more. And so how do these things that we understand, we recognize, but don't encroach upon them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, tie that into scripture too, right? Like we are not to, what's the word? We're not to like offend the child. We're not, I can't even find it. I had a whole list of them. Where'd it go? Oh yeah. We're not to despise, hinder, or offend, but the command is to feed my lambs. So
exactly. Hey, Julie, hang on. Somebody is coming to my door, believe it or not. I'm so sorry.
So I think when she's talking about like the sacredness of personality, she's talking about the sacredness of a child, in that how we need to not, like you're saying, encroach upon that by despising, hindering, or offending them. We need to hold the child in high regard, and we need to look at how our actions are trying to take advantage, I would say, of a child, and using our power and our influence and our actions to change them.
Yes. And I think most of these things that I know we're going to break these down, but I honestly do not think that they're done intentionally, which is why I think this is such a powerful chapter. Most of these things are what we've always done, what we don't even realize we've always done.
Right.
And she even says on page 80, she says, all action comes out of the ideas we hold.
Yep.
And if we ponder duly upon personality, we shall come to perceive that we cannot commit a greater offense than to maim or crush or subvert any part of a person. So it's going back to that very first principle that children are persons. And now what do we do with that, knowing that?
Mm-hmm.
What do we do with that in the way that we influence them? So
I think that's a good point. And it's something I've touched on in several of my other talks, is that all action comes out of ideas. So all of our actions are based on our thoughts and our beliefs.
Yes.
So how we treat children. And like you're saying, some of this is subconscious. We don't even realize we're doing it. Right. And so it's the thoughts of what we perceive a child to be that will create these actions of sometimes taking advantage of their childhood innocence, getting them to kind of do what we want. And it is subtle. But I think it's so important that she brings this to our attention, because we don't realize we're doing it. And oftentimes we do have good intentions, right? We do want our children to be like good citizens and have a bunch of knowledge, and, we want to have a loving, kind relationship with them, and we want their lives to be happy, right? So we're coming out of like, I really love this child, right? It's not like, there are people in the world that are just evil, right, and want to hurt children, but we're not doing it from a place of we want to maim or crush them or hurt them, but we are unintentionally doing that. And that's what she's saying here, which makes it so convicting and so important to realize what we're doing.
And I think for me, the timing of this chapter is really, it's really eye-opening, because I'm doing some classes inside a public school and have been this semester, which is I have not done since I was a public school teacher. Yeah. And as I read this chapter again, and I'm going into these schools, I realized that so much of the entire system is set up on these things that are motives or springs of action that are getting them the results they're getting frustrated with.
Yes, exactly.
And in my home too, right? So me too, yes. But this is an entire system that I'm saying you're getting these results that she talks about. And the reason you're getting them is because you are following this that you think is going to get you a different result. Yes. And so there's frustration and not understanding. And I think, wow, this is really important that if we are going to homeschool, that we don't take that template and just try to put it right on top of our homeschools, because we're going to have the same sorts of frustrations and the same sorts of confusion. Why am I getting this result when I'm really trying to be intentional and do this the quote unquote right way? So there's a lot of powerful information here she gives.
Yeah, I thought of that the whole time I was reading too. Like, it really does bring attention to our modern education system, which was, this was written 100 years ago, and it hasn't changed a whole lot. No. And just how like broken the system is. But we can also be doing things in our home as well. So it's important to kind of talk through these as well. But we can't change the whole system, but we can change. And I think she addresses that in here too. Like, it would be, I forget the word she uses, but like not wise to try to change the system from without. Oh, she says, make war against the educational system from without. We have to do it from within and changing how they're learning, what they're learning, and kind of the process from that, rather than trying to change the whole entire thing.
Which is why we read things like this, and why we take the time to try to understand things like this, because we do want to feel like the time that we're spending is getting the results that we want, because our hearts are in the right place. So I think that's, I hope people will really stop and read this chapter and consider, even though it is, it's deep. I'm not going to lie. It's a lot of info here. So that you can feel like, okay, where do I fall in that spectrum of using these motives or desires?
All right. So she talks about kind of 9 motives, desires that we kind of can take advantage of or play upon, and then one good one. So let's focus on the negative ones first, and how, what it means, how we can sometimes use it, often unintentionally, and what the result can happen with the child and our education from that result. So what was the first one? Fear?
The first one is fear. Okay. Yes. She talks about fear as a governing motive, and that it is not subtle. I thought that was kind of, she's like, it is not subtle when you use fear, which is so true. If you're trying to make a child afraid, it doesn't always have to be like, oh, I'm actually afraid of you. Mm-hmm. It could be, I'm afraid of the results if I don't do my work correctly. And she uses, I thought that was pretty interesting how she uses David Copperfield.
Yeah, so can you explain that reference?
Yes, so she talks about the action of fear as a governing motive. We cannot do better than read again our David Copperfield, a great educational treatise, and study Mr. Creakle in detail for terrorism in the schoolroom, and Mr. Murdstone for the same vice in the home. So what she's talking about, which I think is pretty funny, she's talking about the terrors of the law. So, in other words, these students were horrified and terrified, and maybe you get them to do what you want them to do, but it's only because they're afraid of your anger. That's right. That's the only
and reason. I meant to look up the part in David Copperfield. Maybe we could find it for the show notes, but I didn't have time to look it up. But that scene in when he's in the schoolroom, right, with yes. the teacher, and the use of corporal punishment and how severe that was back then. And yes, they may only do what they're supposed to do, but they're only doing it based on fear. Right. And so what she says that what does that lead to?
So basically, this one, she doesn't have a terribly clear explanation, but what she does talk about is that it's still playing on a motive. And she also talks about it may produce a gray record in comparison with the blackness of more subtle methods of undermining personality. So she says fear is subtle, and the result might be that you're going to get the work done, but you're going to have a fearful child.
Yeah, I think that's because we think, oh, I'm not like David Copperfield's teacher, right? I'm not sitting there with the ruler and all that. With the,
we're not going to pop their hand if they don't get their copy work correct, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah. You forgot a comma. Right. Like, that's not going to happen in my house. But we could still use that subtly.
Yes. It's manipulative.
It is.
And, I had to really okay, I've totally used that. I'm not proud of it. And I didn't realize I was doing it, but I'm like, okay, even comments that we make, well, if you don't do this correctly, then X correctly, then Y can happen. Mm-hmm. That's still a method of fear. Maybe not intentionally,
right?
But I'm like, oh, okay, I see that. Which I think there's a lot of self-reflection that can come out of each one of these when you really stop and say, okay, how am I possibly using that with my own children? And so I can see places where I have used.
And oftentimes I think that comes from our own fear.
Yes.
And if we're not taking our thoughts captive and we're not dealing with the fear that we have about, ruining our kids or being behind or all those things, right? We can project that onto them.
Exactly. And we don't want fearful children.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want my children afraid of me or afraid of the results. I want them to be bold and ready to jump and to try new things. And that's definitely not going to do that.
Yeah. You don't have the courage you don't have that growth mindset when you are basing things out of fear, right? I have to get this perfect or else, right? Yeah. And so you don't take risks. And part of learning is taking risks and making a lot of mistakes and learning from those mistakes. And is the atmosphere of your home one where your children feel that they are allowed to make mistakes and that mistakes are considered good things because they teach us?
Yes.
Like Edison said, right? I learned 1,000 some ways how not to make a light bulb. Like, is that your approach that, now we learn how to not to do this today. Woo! Like
we finally figured out. And one thing I love is that as I read these, I really saw how her methods match her mindset of how to approach a child, because when and she does, of course, discuss narration and she discusses her methods in this chapter, but narration allows a child to take risks. Because I don't have to worry about getting it right or be afraid that I'm not going to fill in the right bubble.
Right.
I get to consider in a freeing sort of way, what do I take from that? Mm-hmm. And fear definitely is not, and we do get questions about this. Like, I feel like my child is afraid that they're not going to get their narrations right. So their narrations are like, have you ever heard a child say, it was about Abraham Lincoln? And, and it was called the Civil War. Yeah. And, there's like a cool bit. And I think he was president, there's that tone at the end, and they're really not narrating. They're asking you, questions. Is this right? Mm-hmm. Right. And so maybe if we tend to get that, we could back up and say, okay, do I use that like spring of action? Do I play on that motive or that personality trait? Do I need to consider that?
Yeah, that's a good one. The second one, I thought at first I was like, what is Cheryl Mason talking about here? Because she's talking about love, which we're like, wait a minute, I'm supposed to love my child, right? How is this a bad motivation or a bad desire or a bad thing I'm doing? And it's not that we're not to love our children or show them affection, right? But we can play on a child's love for their parent and their emotions. So can you explain a little bit about how we could do that?
So she talks about a winning personality that attracts pupils, which I pretty much think this is who gets Teacher of the Year every year. You know what I mean? I'm like, okay. And
okay, I'm gonna admit that, like, when I teach classes, even like homeschool classes, right? I have to be the favorite teacher.
Right. You want to be the personality that they love. I was like, ooh. And you want to, it says they live on the smiles, perish on the averted looks of the adored teacher. And I thought this is pretty interesting because she speaks so much, even in this chapter, about how the food for the mind is ideas. But when we play off of love, we're giving them the food that we're giving them to live off of is our approval, like the smiles, or I'm turning my eyes away from you.
Yeah, and parents will think, oh, all is well, right? Because they love their teacher, right? She says, but Bob or Mary is losing that growing time, which should make a self-dependent, self-ordered person, and is day by day becoming a parasite who can only go on as he is carried. I was like,
yes,
you don't want them to be a parasite, right? I kind of think of like kind of codependent almost, like I'm not happy unless you're happy with me, and I'm not like a good kid unless mommy thinks I'm a good kid today. And she says it makes them, they're not self-dependent, they don't have independence, they're again afraid to take these risks that learning involves, because it's like, oh, I have to please this person at all costs, right? My whole identity as a person is depending on whether or not this person likes me or not.
Yes. And my educational identity is based on what this person thinks I need to learn. And I think it's interesting that she uses self-dependent, self-ordered when she says all education is a self-education.
Yes, that's a
and so we want self-ordered children who we can say, here are your books. Maybe we need to, yes, give them a schedule or a time frame or something, but they're able to monitor their self, learn themselves. And another thing that I love is she says the easy prey of fanatic or demagogue. So what she's saying is, okay, if you make them think that they have to be lovable, then somebody who is not so good could easily prey on them and say, well, I'm going to make you feel like you're not lovable and I'm going to manipulate you. And that is certainly not what we want from our kids. We want them to be able to think through these things on their own. So as we've talked in here many, many, many times, you kind of want to start at the end result you want and go backwards. So, okay, this is not what we want. Am I, using that love and approval? Maybe. So.
Yeah. It's hard because it's very subtle. Yeah. Now, did you have suggestion as another one?
Yes, suggestion is the next one. And yep. So it is also subtle. It plays on human nature, plays on my child's mind, and it's continually changing. So like one day I might want to suggest one thing, the next day I'm going to suggest another thing, the next day another thing. No respect for the personality of the child. And it's dangerous, but it might get immediate results. And to me, that is the thing that is like, okay, I need immediate results. What am I going to do? I'm going to use suggestion. So, and this is from a teacher who has mastered the gamut of motives that play on human nature. And every suggestion is aimed at one of these. So maybe you want to say, we really wanted to go get ice cream later today, but I guess we can't because you didn't finish this, or I can find an example of that because I've literally done it. Not proud, Charlotte. Okay. But yes, I've done it. When I read this one, I was like, ooh, yikes. I literally wrote,
says it's suggestion plays on a child's mind as winds on a weathercock. Mm-hmm. We're just right trying to get them to come to our side subtly, like, oh, don't you really want to do that lesson again?
Right.
Or
don't you think that you should go back and look for something else in that reading? Like, did you miss, it's just, and it feels so natural. It doesn't feel negative, which is why I think she points these things out. They're not technically negative things. Right. They're human nature things that we do, but we don't want to use these in the education of our children is what's really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And she says the danger with suggestion is that they don't have the strength to stand alone and make their own decisions without someone else prompting them with the right thing to do. And I've seen this with kids, teenagers even. They don't know what the right action, like, and then they get all like, well, there can only be one right way, right? Because my whole life I was told this was the one right way. Like I wasn't able to make a decision by myself. And then when they're like teenagers and early adults, they don't know how to.
Right. And, I think this is hard as a parent because, what if they mess up? What if the wind blows them around? And so that's why it's so important for us to have the trust in the living books that we put in front of them that have great examples. Also the divine teacher, which she talks about in here. We're not just throwing this stuff to the wind. We really are trusting the divine teacher, but to be able to let them have the freedom to do things that are outside of our power of suggestion. And maybe we're like, oh, I'm not really sure about that. And the freedom to fail. And that way they don't have to wait on somebody to say, well, you better do this. You better clean your room. You better, even those subtle things like that, you better make sure you get this read.
Yeah. Okay. After suggestion and something very similar, I kind of see them as almost the same thing, is influence. So how would you define that?
So influence is like the atmosphere coming from the teacher. And this is one that I thought a lot about this week as I was going into different classrooms, teaching classes. You can literally walk into a classroom and feel the atmosphere. Yeah. And I think it was really good for me because, she says education is an atmosphere. And we understand that we've talked about that many times. But when you're going into individual classrooms, the atmosphere is very distinct. And it's very palpable.
Yeah.
And so what she's saying here is this, it's not really that word or action. It's just, and I cracked up because she calls it goody books that were written in the, I wrote LOL in my book about the beauty of influence. So she says, hey, we've been telling kids in the whole last century, you need to be influencing others and it needs to be positive. But what she's talking about, yes, it's inevitable. We're going to influence people. And she talks about the inevitability of it. But this is that single, steady, and persistent influence that she talks about. And what we don't want is the supineness or openness, or like to lay supine, it's like to lay just like open before somebody's influence. Like we're so weak and laid back that you could just push me with a feather and I would fall over. And that's what she's talking about that is dangerous from influence.
Yeah. And I think it's a really good point because, and I talk about this a lot with atmosphere. I think we did a podcast on that, didn't we? Well, we can put that one in the show notes. But one of my favorite quotes ever is just this concept of atmosphere. And it was so convicting for me because, like you said, when you're in it, you don't realize what the atmosphere of your home is like. But when you go into someone else's house, you can almost instantly get the vibe and the atmosphere, and you kind of feel that it's different than your house, right?
Right.
So our houses have this, and Charlotte makes this 1/3 of the tools we have for education Is this influence? Is this atmosphere? And is it being used for good, or is it, being something that is a detriment? And I think in order to have good influence, we can feel like kind of this weight of having to get all this moral teaching into our children. And so we have to kind of like stuff it down their throats with like what she's talking about, these goody books, which were extremely popular in the 1800s in Victorian England, all little morality books all the time, and where you don't see characters struggle, where you don't see them make, hard life choices, where you don't see them really just fail and mess up and go, oh, I don't want to do that. Right.
Right. Yes, exactly. Which is what real life is like.
Exactly. Right. But everything has to be cleaned and washed up. And this is the only books we can have in our house and the only things we can kind of read and teach our kids.
Right. And she says that the danger of this, the result of this, is that it deprives our children of free and independent living. It fails to develop personality, and they're a parasitic plant clinging to someone of stronger character. I can never have the character of my own. I've got to always have that influence of somebody. And I've seen this in my own children. I think some children are more swayed than others just by personality. So I have some children like, okay, if you're with this group, you're going to be like this. If you're with this group, you're going to be like this. If you're, and so it's so important to recognize that and say, okay, so what is my influence on them? What is the atmosphere that I'm putting forward? Am I allowing them to stand on their own 2 feet, grow their own roots, not a parasitic plant, but get their own roots deep down into life?
Yeah. And I loved the Heritage Mom's new book, A Place to Belong, and kind of allowing it to be an atmosphere where we can have hard discussions and we can learn and value and have empathy for people that are different than us, but also feel a sense of connection of our own story and our own family history. And I just love that picture of that, because that really is kind of that way influence can be good, but it takes you thinking through, like, what are my values? What are the influences that are really important to me that I do want to have? And everybody's different, right? I mean, and that's the thing, like, you go in different people's houses and the atmosphere is just different because every family's different. But it's thinking through, like, okay, what is really important to me? And I want to share that love and that joy of the things that I care about with my kids. And they might grow up and they might do something different, but I'm sharing that. It fills me up. It fills my cup up to have things in my house that light me up, and go to concerts and go to theater and do the things that, like, we really love as a family, that somebody else be like, I don't want to do that.
Right. And that way they have the freedom to, by watching you have freedom, they have the freedom to grow their own roots. Yeah. And that's just so important, especially now that I have children that are grown and gone. And they make choices that not terrible choices, but maybe not choices I would make. And they, kind of wish you would have done that, but they have the freedom to do those things and still discuss it with me. Which is so different. When you have older children, I think you look at some of these things maybe a little bit differently, because my influence on them is a lot different than it used to be.
Oh, yeah.
It used to be like, no, you're not going to do that because that's not what we do. You're going to do this, Now it's like, I'm going to keep my mouth shut and let you make your choice. And if you come to me for advice, then I'll be happy to tell you, but otherwise mom's going to zip, So there's a lot of wisdom for every stage of parenting, I think, in that particular one.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Okay, so far we've had fear, love, suggestion, and influence. And she says that these are incidental ways, again, sometimes most of the time, subconscious ways we're infringing upon the rights of personality proper to children. But we have more pervasive, if less injurious, ways of stultifying intellectual and moral growth. So these ones are more easy to recognize if you're doing, but they are not as injurious as those 4 that we just mentioned. Those are the most powerful influences you have, and something you really have to consider and guard against.
Right. And I think it's important to know that we should use, she says, other places, we use these desires that she calls, or appetites or whatever. It's just in fact, she says, therefore, schoolmasters do not amiss in basing their practice upon the desires whose very function appears to be to bring nourishment to mind. But where we teachers err is in stimulating the wrong desires to accomplish our end. So we know that there's things we're playing on. That's okay. That's normal human interaction.
Right.
But how are we using these ones? Because these are very persuasive, she says. So,
yeah. All right. So what's the first one?
The first one is approbation or approval. And she even talks about how even with babies, yeah, they're not even happy. You're like, oh, yay, you stood up. We clap our hands and go, yay. Or you waved bye-bye. Yay, good job. So this is natural. It's normal. And she even says there's positive in it because it can help you conquer a sum, climb a hill, bring home a good report from school. All this is knowledge to the mind. It's important. But the danger here is if you are not happy unless someone is approving of you.
Yeah, because then you can grow up to be like me and be an overachiever who burns out all the time.
I'm not even going to touch that one. I'll just let you live that one right there.
When I read that, I was like, oh, dang. That's me living for everyone's approval.
It's like, okay, listen, Charlotte, could you put the mirror down? Because I was not planning on seeing so much of myself in this today. Okay? This is not good.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Moving on.
Well, I think you have reined in that desire for approval. I think you handle it very well. But the danger is if you think of nothing else.
Right.
Because sometimes you want approval from somebody that you have no business getting approval from. And she even says infamy can also come from a form of approval. So that's what's important. And if you sit back and you look and you think, is my child constantly wanting me to say, yes, good job. Yes, great job. Yes, you did great. We do need to say that, don't get me wrong, but is that the food that your child is living off of?
Yeah.
Then you need to step back and breathe a minute and think, oh, okay, maybe I need to consider how I'm maybe using approbation with a heavy hand.
Yeah. And we don't necessarily do the same things that they do, in a school setting with that, No,
we don't. Goodness.
Yeah. But like you said, it can come in overpraising for sure. Kind of trying to accomplish, the next task. This, I'll feel good about myself when this happens, and it keeps increasing what you have to do to earn someone's approval, Right. Rather than, like I said, kind of that growth mindset of, and like I said, I was kind of half joking, but like me as a student was definitely like, oh my gosh, I got a B+ on this test. My whole life is over,
Yeah, you too. I'm not proud of it.
Oh, well, I did learn quite a bit, or it was never for knowledge sakes, right?
Right.
It was for the marks, which we'll talk about with the next thing. But if it's the vanity of trying to always get approval from someone, then you're not getting that approval from within yourself, which is what we want our children to be able to do, is to feel good and accomplished for themselves and for the process. So rather than being like, great job or whatever, be like, oh my gosh, you tried really hard on that.
Yes.
Praising effort rather than the result.
Or you could say, look how much more you got done last time. One place we struggle with this, honestly, and is in dictation, because we never get through a whole passage. And so when we first started, it used to drive my 5th grader crazy, because she's like, okay, I finished the pass. Sometimes we don't finish it off for copy work. That would drive her crazy. Right. And so she would get really frustrated. So sometimes I would have to say, look how much further we got than last time, or look how much your handwriting has improved. And this is why sticker charts work for like a week.
Well, yeah, that goes with the next thing, right?
Emulation. Yes, it goes with both. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you want to,
emulation. Yes. The desire of excelling. And so, okay, now I'm looking in the mirror. It's an amazing spur to effort, and it does give a school a good tone. She says, like, everybody wants to walk into a school or a homeschool where there's a sense of excellence. Mm-hmm. Everybody wants that. That is a positive thing. It's a great thing. Everybody wants excellence. I even saw this billboard last week, and my husband was the one, like, you've been listening to as much Charlotte Mason stuff with me, bless your heart, because it said such and such a school where every child is a leader. And he said, Charlotte would not like that billboard. And I said, no, she would not, because every child cannot be a leader, right? The world cannot be run by leaders.
That's the opposite of the definition of a leader.
Right. I was like, okay. But the problem here is that it will make them work only to get their remove, or in other words, their marks or their prize. And they don't think of anything else.
Yes, she says, in the intellectual field, however, there is danger. Nothing worse could have happened to our schools than the system of marks, prizes, place taking, which is pretty much just standard.
By which, many of them are practically governed.
And not just even sticker charts, but just the whole concept of grades.
The whole concept. I got an A, and
even I got a sticker. When I was a little kid, we had like the scratch and sniff smelly stickers. I mean, I worked so hard for those scratch and sniff smelly stickers. Those were the best things ever.
Right. And I was the exact same way. I'm like, well, wait a minute. I didn't get an A, I got a B. Tell me what it takes to get the A. Yep. Tell me what it takes, because those marks, grades were super important. And I got to be honest, this one, when I read this, I was like, okay, I needed to hear that, because sometimes you do, when we follow this Charlotte Mason method, of course, when they're older, they do get grades and we do exams and stuff. But sometimes, you hear that little voice, especially the public school teacher voice. You're not giving them a grade. Yeah. Where is the grade? You're not doing it.
What they're learning.
How will they know? I'm like, okay, yes, thank you for the reminder, Charlotte. Yes. Needed that.
And what happens is, like you're saying, and I think we're kind of where she's going here with the approval and the emulation, and some of the other ones we're going to talk about, is this kind of concept of internal motivation versus external motivation. Yes. She didn't have that terminology back then. That's fairly new psychology kind of concept, but we want our children to be intrinsically motivated. We want them to love knowledge and love learning for knowledge's sakes, right? Not because of these external things. So I think of prizes, marks as the most external you can get, right? And what happens, Alfie Kohn wrote the book Punished by Rewards. What happens is it might even be something you actually want to do. And then when you get a reward or a prize from it, it takes away your desire to actually want to do the thing. So you actually gets the reverse effect of deadening your desire to want to do the thing.
Right. I saw that in my son, because he loves to work on cars, my oldest son. And so he thought for a while that he wanted to go into mechanics and, took some little courses and stuff like that. And then he realized, but Mom, then I have to do it for pay. And it takes every bit of the joy out of it.
That was my daughter with photography. Yep, the same exact thing. Mm-hmm.
It just took the joy right out. He's like, I don't want to do that. Like, I don't want to do it for pay. It takes every bit of joy. I'd rather have a job, which he does, graduate college, has a job, has absolutely nothing to do with the auto mechanics, but he'll spend hours and hours here with his dad, restoring cars, restoring vehicles, because it's for the joy of the knowledge.
Yes, right.
It's for the joy of the action itself. So that's really important.
When my one daughter had to take speech lessons, we took them at the public school, and it was after school, and it was in the library. And one day I was waiting outside the speech teacher's office, and in the library, the teachers were having a meeting, and they were discussing the rewards for their reading program. So they had a reading program. It's called Accelerated Reader. Each book kind of has a level. You read the book, you take this online quiz on the computer, which is very basic recall questions. And then the children get so many points. And if you get so many points, they would get different prizes. And so now they're kind of planning this end of the year thing. And they're like, should we have an ice cream party or a pizza party? Or, well, what should the level be to get XYZ prize versus, they were just going on and on and on. And I'm like, does this make the child actually enjoy reading at all?
No,
not at all.
No.
In fact, it makes them enjoy reading less. They'll zoom through a book, like when I taught 5th grade in post. I mean, they'll zoom through a book to take that quiz to get the points, but they're not reading because they love to read. And they often pick the easiest book they can so they can get through it and get those points, rather than this literature is really enjoyable.
Right. And I have seen kids, because I do a lot of tutoring, I've literally asked me, well, what's the AR level?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Because that's what matters, not what is the book about.
Yeah.
But right. They know that they're expected to read on this particular level. They need to get to this particular, like I'm on a 3, I got to get to a 5 or whatever. They need to get there, not the content of the knowledge itself, but it's kind of heartbreaking to be honest. It really breaks my heart. Yeah.
They're actually sucking the love of knowledge out by all these external things they have going on.
Yes.
And they think they're doing the opposite. And that's what's so, sad. And what Charlotte Mason's trying to point out. And one of the things I thought was really interesting with this whole emulation concept is she talks about the concept of scholarships and how, because we both have college kids, like we totally know how this works, right? And we get this question all the time, like, because, I got to get my kid a scholarship, we got to get into college, right? And Charlotte Mason saying this 100 years ago, that the way the system is set up is that children, who can't necessarily afford university, so children of middle class, right? They have to learn a certain way to get certain marks so they could get a scholarship, so they could go to university, so they could get this kind of job.
Yes.
And she's saying this scholarship system is no more than a means of distributing the vast wealth left behind by benefactors in the past. I was like, oh, that's so true.
I believe it.
But she says this leads to an enfeebled intellectual life. The boy did not learn to delight in knowledge in his school days, and now the man is shallow in mind and whimsical in judgment, which is so true. And she's saying, we can't necessarily change that system. And, and I see people asking us about high school all the time. It's like, you can learn how to take an SAT in a couple months and all the tricks. It's just a bunch of tricks anyway, to answer the questions, to get a certain score. If your state has that, to get this scholarship, right?
Right.
But you don't have to spend your whole education working up to that moment in order to get a scholarship.
Right. I mean, it is a system. And I remember when my oldest was like 8th grade, I went with a friend of mine and we went to this meeting. I was like, okay, you have high school kids coming up, it's going to be great. We both left this meeting and we got in the car and cried because I was like, oh no, what have I done? Because it was really about how to beat the system and what your kids basically needed to start doing in the 6th grade if they're homeschooled in order to beat the system and get these fabulous scholarships. And now I see, wow, you played on fear, you played on that so much.
Love that you have
because I love my kids and that I want to emulate these other parents that seem like they've done an amazing job because I want to do the best for my kids. Now I have more wisdom. But I've graduated 3 who went to school and got scholarships, and it is possible to do without basing it on these, on these desires or springs of action for their entire educational career. It just doesn't have to be.
It doesn't have to be that way for sure. And she says in here, like I was telling you about, we're not going to change the system from without. And so she's saying, what can we do? Well, her suggestion is that they should have 20 to 16 consecutive readings a week and get a wide selection of books, literature, history, economics, etc. Books read with concentrated attention, single readings should suffice. Yes. The act of narrating what has been read might well be useful to boys who should be prepared for public speaking. A slight alteration of the timetable. So right here, she's saying the solution is kind of all my methods that I've been telling you.
Right. I know. I love that. I was like, you go, Charlotte. Tell them what we're supposed to be doing. It's not complicated. The whole thing is like in 5 sentences there. She's like, basically, this is what we're doing.
People make this whole it's so complicated. No, right here, here's what you do. You have these readings that are literature based. You have narrating. You have concentrated attention, single readings, short timetable lessons. mic drop, right? And she's saying such a method, even if just applied to English only, would tend to correct any tendency in schools to become mere cramming places for examinations, would infect boys with a love of knowledge and to divert the natural desire for acquisition into a new channel. For few things are more delightful than the acquisition of knowledge.
That is just so powerful. Like I just want to like pull this out and hand it to the people who say, I cannot homeschool. Yeah. Yes, you can, because this is super simple. Also, I want to make the point here that she's in this particular section, she's talking about older children.
Yeah, high school.
And yes.
You see, she only refers to boys because those are the only people that were allowed to go to high school.
Yes. Yeah. And that's really important because we'll see people say, okay, well, yeah, I can do Charlotte Mason because it's super fun. It's reading these cute books when they're little.
We're going on nature walks. It's so cute.
And we're going on nature walks and we'll do the handicrafts. But then when it like counts, I say in quotation marks, and it's for credit, I can't do that. It's not enough. Yeah. I cannot tell you how many times people have said, yes, but is that enough?
Yeah.
It's so much if it like she says, infects them with the love of knowledge.
Yeah. I had someone ask me recently at one of the conventions. So if my child's like reading like living books in high school, will they be able to like read a textbook if they go to college and it's a textbook reading? I mean, shouldn't they use a textbook in high school so they get used to textbooks? And I was like, what? No, trust me, if you've read all of Winston Churchill's A History of England, that's about 4,000 pages, you're definitely going to be able to comprehend a textbook, which is watered down little bits of information, right?
Yes.
If nothing else, like with my children, it frustrates them how mind-numbingly boring the textbooks are in college. And they're like, why am I paying this much to take this class with this?
Right. Like and why did I pay $300 for this book when I could have taken, this book that is super interesting? It makes me think of you. She's always using this metaphor, but it's like saying, listen, one day you're going to have some really bad pizza. So for your whole life, we're going to give you cardboard pizza. It's going to taste terrible. It's like frozen gross. I'm never going to give you like the real stuff. Just keep eating this because we don't know if you'll be able to handle that really gross pizza. You know what I'm saying?
If you've had good pizza your whole life, you're not going to like the gross pizza. So we just
gross
pizza.
Right.
It sounds like a great strategy.
Yes. And so I'm like, no, we're going to give them these amazing books in high school. We're going to give them these amazing, rich stories and characters and people who struggle and, try to figure out the answer. We're going to let them read those while they're going through that stuff. And then if one day they have to eat the really boring pizza, the gross cardboard pizza will be like, I know there's better stuff out there than this.
Yeah. And my kids even said, like, I know I just have to check off this general ed requirement and get through it. But that isn't what's making them love history.
Exactly.
It's because they've read these other things before. Yes. They have this love of knowledge and they have this desire to learn. If anything, I feel like college is suffocating that desire a little bit, which is sad, right? But that's part of this game. You have to play to get through the system and what you're doing. Right. Not that everyone has to go, which I totally don't think that's what the path everyone needs to take. But if they do choose that path, right, it doesn't mean that, like you're saying, we have to give them this mediocre, horrible way of learning their whole life to prepare them for something that's going to be mediocre.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I don't know why, it took me, this is 100 years ago, and she doesn't even have, like you're saying, the psychological language that we have today to describe these things. Mm-hmm. But can you imagine she saw the system now?
Nope.
Can you imagine? I can't imagine.
What are some of the other desires? What comes next? Is it power?
Okay, power and ambition. She kind of puts together. These can be good in proportions, she says.
Yeah.
Because it gives us an opportunity for serving, but it is mischievous in boy or man when the pleasure of ruling, managing, becomes a definite spring of action. So we're going to have this, but she says it can ruin a life if you allow it to master you.
Yes.
And she says that it causes people to lead in negative ways.
Yeah.
So that's super important. And we've all, you can turn on the radio and hear this, people who have a lust for power.
Oh, yeah.
The ambitious boy or man would as soon lead his fellows in riot and disorder as in noble effort in a good cause. So I think it's really important. She has a quote here. It says, "It is a fine thing to say of a multitude of men, I can wind them around my little finger. And the much burdened head of a school must needs beware." So it's important.
So you don't think the motto of the school, Shay, should be everyone's here as a leader? Do you think it maybe should be everyone here as a servant?
Yeah, right. Can you imagine? I don't think they would get a lot of the tuition that they're planning on getting.
Yeah, we all want our kids to be leaders and be in charge, and right. But yeah, what she's saying, it's the quote. I think it was Winston Churchill, but don't correct me on that one. That absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yes.
And she's coming around off the heels of World War I here, so she's seeing that what can happen with absolute power, right? And so it can be a good thing. Being a leader can be a very good thing, but with that power and position, there comes a great propensity to do harm as well if you're not trained into how to use those affections well. So, we all want our children to excel and we all want them to be in charge, but are we preparing them to do that in a way that has the good character? And she's saying, if you're only doing that for power's sake, then no.
Right. And I think it does take intentional stepping back to look at your children to see if you see this in your children.
Yeah.
Right. Like, am I using it? Yes. But also, and this time of year, like right now when we're recording this, summer's about to start. So, you can step back and sort of go over these things and consider, how do I address this in myself and in my children for next year? That's really important.
Yes, that's good. Okay. The next desire, which is kind of funny because it does apply to us today, but I think this word doesn't apply, is the desire for society.
Yes. So she's using the word society as in, she calls it mixing with our fellows.
Yes.
So basically, she's talking about, and I love this quote. It says, "It is a sheer delight to mix with our fellows, but much depends on whom we take for our fellows and why." So in other words, yes, we love to hang out with the people that we hang out with and let the people that influence us. But are we considering why we are choosing those ones to be involved, those people to be involved with? It says, if they are so taught that knowledge delights them, they will choose companions who share that pleasure. And I really find that to be so true. If you have children who my kids talk to children, oh my gosh, I hate school. I hate going to school. I hate the schoolwork and it's boring. And, they're saying that because they've never had a desire for knowledge incited within them. They've never been delighted by knowledge.
Yeah, right.
And so you want your children to understand that for themselves and hopefully have companions that are also, mixing with the fellows that.
And I thought this was really important because if we are people who are able to talk on a variety of subjects, which this great feast provides for our children, but also for us, right? It does make us worthy companions for people, but it also keeps us from being insular into our social categories. We don't really have classes, but we kind of do still, because we're able to talk to anybody.
Right.
And if we don't have this desire for knowledge, we can become very insular and surrounding ourselves with people who only think and act like we do, because we're not able to talk. We haven't had such this wide perspective, this great room that she talks about, where we have all these ideas that we can listen to people who we might totally disagree with them, but we are able to have a great conversation. Actually, this just happened to me at the pool a couple of weeks ago. We talked for like 2 hours. This one mom, we were totally opposites on like everything. But she's like, I've just never been able to have a conversation with someone who I really don't agree with you, but like This has been a very fascinating conversation.
Right.
And I don't know if I would have been able to have that conversation years ago.
And if you're run by fear, which is what we talked about in the beginning, if our children are, oh, will my parents approve of this person that I'm having this conversation with? Or, if they're run by fear, to be afraid of mixing with other fellows is the phrase that she uses, then they're not going to be willing to have those conversations on their own like you were. Mm-hmm. And that's what we want. So I do think some of this is like tied to a little bit of the time period.
Right. Yeah.
But we definitely do see it for sure right now.
Yeah. Well, she's saying such consideration rules the education of princes, like having this wide feast, right?
Right.
And every boy has a principal right to be brought up so that he may hold his own in good society. So and I kind of like we are all entitled to the education of princes. And I love that kind of idea. Like we are giving our children the education that used to only be reserved for royalty.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I love how she talks about the princes there: scientists, adventurers, poets, painters, philanthropists, or economists. Mm-hmm. All these people that we want our children to be involved in, and used to, they could not.
Right.
They could not talk with those children. And now I can make that available to them, even if it's just in the books that I'm putting in front of them. But I want my children to be able to have conversations with all of those types of people, just like a prince at one time would only have been able to.
Yes. So if they ever get invited to tea with the queen, my children, I would love them to be able to have an intellectual conversation.
Thank you. And I'm sure that yours would.
Oh, yes, totally. Maybe she'll invite us when we're there in a couple weeks. Okay.
Oh, I don't want to talk about that with you. So jealous. All
right. So what's the last desire?
The last desire is the desire that we are allowed to use freely. Okay.
Yes. Woo!
But now we're set free, and it's called the desire of knowledge. Now she does say that each such desire we've talked about before has its place, right? Yeah. But the last desire, the desire of knowledge, is commonly deprived of its proper function in our schools by the predominance of the other springs of action, especially of emulation, the desire of place, and avarice, which is greed, the desire of wealth, tangible profit. This divine curiosity is recognized in ordinary life chiefly as a desire to know trivial things. So I think this was so interesting because and she goes on to talk about how we've believed that children think of knowledge as repulsive medicine.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great metaphor, right? She says, we think children regard knowledge as repulsive as medicine rather than inviting food. Again, that's the feast there. Hence, our dependence on marks and prizes, athletics, alluring presentation. If she could only see like what's happening now with like the light show, like pay attention, kids. I feel like it's
exactly constantly entertaining.
Any jam we can devise to disguise the powder. So a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. Like this knowledge is so horrible, and children hate this so much that we have to add all this jam and all this other sugary sweet stuff in order to get them to take it. Where it's like, no, this is a divine desire born inside of a person. They have this divine curiosity.
Right.
We are taking it out of them with all the other things.
Yes, it is the food. It is the meat that our children really want.
Give me some more of that.
Yes, and I do find that so we get this a lot. So children who have been in other educational settings,
right,
and are very used to lots and lots and lots of jam.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
May in the beginning find it difficult, to acquire a taste for the real food.
Yes.
And so I just want to really encourage parents, if you're listening to this and you're saying, okay, I hear what you're saying, but my kid does look at it as repulsive medicine. Mm-hmm. It's probably because they have not acquired a taste for it yet. It will come. I promise you it will come. But you do have to keep feeding that food. You can't go back to the jam. Right. If you go back to the jam and your kid just keeps tasting jam and keeps tasting jam, like, well, we have to do an activity with every single thing. And I have to give like the super fun lights and show action. And I have to, or else they just don't learn it.
Yep.
You do have to do through that what's the word I'm looking for? It's like you have to get off of, like, if you're getting off of drugs, what's the word that you use?
Oh, detox.
Detox. Yes. Yeah. You have to detox from the jam.
Right. Well, and sugar is addictive. So there you go.
It does. It takes time, but it will, it really will happen. And what I find is funny is, so especially my older two, they got no jam. Very little jam. They are very sensitive to the extras and they don't want it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They want the knowledge for the knowledge's sake. They want the good book. They want the interest without the extra. So that's really powerful right there.
Yeah. She says, our young men and maidens do not read unless with the stimulus of a forthcoming examination. They are good-natured and pleasant, but have no wide range of thought, lofty purpose, little of the magnanimity which is proper for a citizen. And that's so true. I mean, when I tell public school, the kids are always like, is this going to be on the test? Like, we don't want to learn this. We're not interested in it. We could care less. All we need to know is if this is important so I can get this mark, right?
Right.
And we're not just reading just because we love to read and we want to learn. It's like, no, is this an assignment? Do we have to do this? Yes. And what happens with that is they might be nice kids, right? She's saying they're pleasant here, but they don't have a lofty purpose. They don't have a purpose for what they're doing in their lives. I often see that. And I love that word, magnanimity, magnanimous, larger than life is the kind of person that we want to raise. And I want to raise. And so how do I make a magnanimous fruit? There has to be this big feast.
Yes. And I just love the next line says, great thoughts and great actions are strange to them. And that's what we want our children to have, great thoughts, great actions. But we must put them in touch with living books that are full of people who have had great thoughts, great actions. Let them chew on that food. Because the next paragraph, she says, knowledge is delectable.
I love that. Right?
I do too. And when I think about delectable, do you know what I love? Do you know the little their cream puff, the little frozen cream puffs that you get? Mm-hmm. Okay. I get mine from Sam's.
With the chocolate on top?
Yes.
Okay.
And I love to freeze them and eat them on hot. That is what came to my mind when it's delectable.
To me, it was salted dark chocolate caramels.
Okay. I'm with you there. Love those. I mean, there's also an ice cream called Exhausted Parent at a place nearby that's like coffee ice cream with dark chocolate chunks. I'm completely addicted to this ice cream.
That is the best ice cream name ever.
That's the name, Exhausted Parent. I love it so much.
That is so funny. I love that.
It's so good. That is delectable to me, right? Yeah. And so that's the way I want my children to feel when they are reading something, learning something, that it's delectable. It feels so good. That same rush you get when you eat that yummy, yummy thing.
Yeah.
That's the way I want them to feel as they're reading and learning. This is delectable.
Yeah. She says the work of education is greatly simplified when we realize that children, apparently all children, want to know all human knowledge. They have the appetite for what is before them. Knowing this, our teaching becomes buoyant with the courage of our conviction.
That's so powerful right there. Yeah. And if their teaching doesn't feel buoyant, if you feel dragged down and every day is a drag and every day is boring and really hard and you're pulling back out the textbook, what do I do to make it buoyant? And this is what I do. I look at the courage of my convictions that the divine teacher has taught us how we can teach our children. And this is what we use. Oh, and just simple. I love that paragraph.
Yes, it's supposed to be simple. So do you have any closing thoughts here as we wrap up the chapter?
The last section I marked, and I think it's a great bookmark, and it says, there is no faculty within the soul which can be spared in the great work of education. But then every faculty, or rather power, works to the one end, if we make the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake the object of our educational efforts. And you could almost put that in a banner.
You need to cross stitch that.
Oh, I could.
Knowledge for knowledge's sake. There you go.
Yes. Knowledge for knowledge's sake, right? That is the reason we're doing what we do.
Yes. And then we don't need to play in all these desires, because that desire for knowledge is so great and innate within a child that is what propels them to keep moving forward. And we don't have to externally pull them along every day.
Right.
There are going to be days, yes, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we don't have to kind of rely on these other things, which he says are harmful for them.
Right.
Because then we're counteracting what we want, right? We want them to have this love of knowledge, but our actions are actually making that harder for the child. We are, he talks in here about I think the last part that we didn't get to, about atrophy, like if our muscles aren't being used. So if their mental muscle, that self-education, that going to knowledge for knowledge's sake, isn't being used, isn't being worked, because we're enabling them and doing all these other things to manipulate them, that will lead to this mental atrophy, which actually makes it harder for them to have knowledge for knowledge's sake.
Right. And we can counteract it, like I was talking about earlier. If you see that in your children, we can. It's corrected. I don't ever want anybody, when we talk about these things, to say, oh gosh, well, my kid's in 8th grade, too late. It's not. No. You do have to look like it would be like atrophy muscle that needs strengthening. What do we do to strengthen that muscle? And then that's where we start. In the beginning, it's going to be harder. It's going to be tougher. We've got to acquire that taste, work that muscle, but it really, really is worth it in the end, because you're going to get the results that is the whole reason that we're doing what we're doing every single day, and providing these books in this feast.
And I think, to your point, that it's never too late. I mean, I was in my 30s before I started really implementing this philosophy. And as I started doing it and reading these things, like I had to go from that approval, marks, motivation. My whole education life was based upon that, right? Yes. And I'm not going to learn this unless it's going to be on the, tests and blah, blah, I had that mindset too, and so as I saw the beauty of that, I changed as a person, and now I desire knowledge for knowledge's sake. And I'll be like, oh, I'm curious, what kind of tree is that? Or, oh, what's that bird over there? And I'm always like looking stuff up, and I'm always trying to find out more stuff, because as you do it, your appetite does increase for those kind of things. So
yes, that's
never too late.
Never too late. I'm 48 and it's not too late. I'm still learning. So
yeah. All right. Well, thanks for joining me. This was a great conversation, Shay. I appreciate it.
Thanks. It was always lots of fun.